bag hit the mat and slid to a stop against the wall. Nobody moved to help her pick it up. "None of you are getting through today's evaluation," Colonel Grant Ashby said, walking the length of the mat with his hands clasped behind his back. "And that includes the girl who wandered into my facility off a bus." He'd taken her duffel by the strap between two fingers, like he didn't want to touch the fabric too long, and thrown it against the cinder block wall of the training hall. It landed with a dull thud. A rolled towel spilled out of the side pocket and unrolled itself slowly across the mat, the way a flag does when nobody's holding the other end. The room laughed. 22 recruits in gray iron-line training shirts, all of them watching to see if she'd flinch. She didn't. She walked over, picked the towel up off the floor, folded it in thirds, and set it back inside the bag. Then she zipped the bag closed and stood back up. Have you ever watched a man decide that a 26-year-old black woman didn't belong in his building before she'd said a single word to him? That's the thing that stuck with me, not the bag. The bag. The bag was nothing. It was the way he turned back to the room afterward, like he hadn't just done something, like the whole exchange had already been erased from the record the second he looked away from her. I'm Cole Uncovers, and I dig up the stories the people running the room would prefer stayed buried. This one, they nearly managed it. Twice. Iron Line Defense Institute sits on 40 acres of pine woods about an hour outside Quantico, Virginia, behind a gate that most people driving past assume belongs to a hunting lodge. It isn't a hunting lodge. It's one of the most selective, close-quarters combatives academies in the country. The kind of place that federal contractors and private security firms send their best people when they want them to come back better. The main training hall is a converted airplane hangar with padded floors, the color of dried blood, and a mezzanine ringed in observation glass, where instructors and evaluators stand with clipboards and watch you the way scientists watch mice. And for 11 years, every incoming class at Iron Line has opened the same way. On the first Friday, before anyone's had a real meal in the mess hall, before anyone's learned each other's names, Colonel Grant Ashby runs what the senior staff call, without irony, the Veil Protocol. He is 61 years old, 22 years in the Army, most of them classified. The last 8 running combatives curriculum for 3 different federal training pipelines. He has a wall in his office, covered in photographs of him standing next to generals. Around the facility, the junior instructors call him the filter, because that's what he tells recruits every single cycle on day 1. "My job," he says, "is not to teach you. My job is to filter out the people who don't belong in this building before this building wastes any more time on them." The Veil Protocol is a live demonstration. Ashby sets up a scenario: 1 armed role player, 2 unarmed, a confined space, 90 seconds on the clock, and he runs it himself in front of the entire incoming class, standing in as the lone defender. No recruit has ever been invited to run it alongside him on day 1. It's not a test they take. It's a test they watch him pass, over and over, year after year, so that by the time he turns around and says, "That's the standard," some of you will get there. Most of you won't. The room already believes him, because they just watched him do something that looked impossible. Every recruit in that hangar on this particular Friday knew that history. Every single one. Now here's the recruit in the corner with the folded towel. Her name is Sella Duncan. 24 years old, 5 years enlisted, 2 combat deployments as an Army combat medic attached to a light infantry unit, honorably discharged 8 months earlier, after a knee injury that ended her active duty career, but not, as it turned out, much else about her. She grew up in a 2-bedroom rental outside Columbus, Georgia, close enough to Fort Benning that half the kids in her elementary school had a parent in uniform. Her father, Isaiah Duncan, was Army Special Forces, a Green Beret medic and hand-to-hand instructor who spent 14 years training operators in close-quarters combatives, before a training accident during a hollow exercise took his life when Sella was 7. Before he died, He taught her the way some fathers teach their kids to ride a bike. On the back porch, on the living room rug, in the gravel behind the house. He kept a green canvas notebook, water-stained at the corners, filled with his own diagrams, joint locks, disarms, footwork sequences he'd developed and refined over a career most of which nobody, outside a handful of units, would ever know about. He wrote in the margins. He drew stick figures with arrows. He left that notebook to Sella when he died, and she has carried it in the bottom of every duffel bag she's owned since she was old enough to pack her own. So why was she standing in Ashby's hangar on a Friday in a training pipeline built for elite private contractors? 3 months earlier, a training officer who'd worked with Sella at Benning submitted her name without asking her first to a foundation that funds combatives scholarships for veterans transitioning out of active duty, specifically ones who distinguished themselves in ways their paperwork never fully captured. Sella's file included 2 commendations for pulling wounded soldiers under fire, and a base-level combatives instructor rating that her old company commander had pushed through faster than regulations technically allowed, because, in his words, she's better than the men teaching the class. The scholarship crossed the desk of Colonel Renata Sloan, Iron Line's Director of Training Development, who runs a program called the Threshold Initiative. 6 full scholarship seats a year for veterans from under-resourced backgrounds who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford the $12,000 tuition. Colonel Sloan signed off on Sella's acceptance herself. She did not run it past Ashby. She didn't think she had to. The threshold seats were her program, funded through a separate grant, and Ashby's opening day ritual had never once, in 11 years, included a scholarship recruit standing in the front row. Sella's mother, Corinne Duncan, a labor and delivery nurse who'd taken one of her rare weekends off, had driven her daughter the 6 hours up from Georgia herself. She sat in the observation gallery in her good cardigan, in the back row, so Sella could stand where her father had always told her the ones who mean it stand. Front and center, because the ones who mean it, he said, want to be seen. And so the small signals started, the way they always do. Sergeant Wyatt Boone, Ashby's training assistant, clocked Corinne and Sella the second they walked through the hangar doors. He gave them the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. "Ladies, I think you're looking for the visitor center. It's the building with the flags out front." Corinne quietly produced the acceptance letter, signed by Colonel Sloan. Boone read it twice, handed it back without a word of apology, and turned away. A recruit near the front, tall, built like he'd never lost an arm wrestling match in his life, shifted his gym bag off the mat space next to him without looking up, the way you'd clear room for someone you didn't want brushing against you by accident. When Ashby walked in, Colonel Sloan, who'd come down from her office specifically to watch, made the introduction herself. Ashby didn't turn around. "Wonderful," he said, loud enough to carry. "Bring your daughter to work day." A few recruits laughed. Boone laughed loudest. That's when he took the bag. Sela didn't look at her mother after that. She reached down, unzipped the front pocket of her bag one more time, and touched the edge of the green notebook just once, like checking it was still there. Then she zipped it shut and stood up straight. And Ashby turned to the mat, cracked his knuckles, and called for his first 2 role players. What he ran that morning wasn't the standard Vale protocol. Somebody would later say, quietly, and only after everything that followed, that he'd changed it, made it harder, made it specifically a scenario that favored size and reach over the kind of technical, economy of motion work a smaller fighter relies on. Confined hallway mock-up, low light, 1 role player with a training blade, 2 more closing from the sides. 90 seconds. He ran it flawlessly, the way he always did. Textbook disarms, clean footwork, both unarmed role players controlled and down before the clock hit 60. He stood up, breathing easy, and let the room absorb what they'd just watched. 11 years, he said. Somewhere around 400 recruits have stood in this hangar and watched me run that drill. Not one of them has ever been invited to run it with me on day one, because not one of them has earned that invitation on day one. I don't expect that to change today. He turned, slow and deliberate, and found Sella in the front row. Though I suppose if the young lady in the back of the line would like to demonstrate what 5 years of active duty apparently taught her, I could use a volunteer role player. Unarmed, slow if that's easier. A few recruits laughed, quieter this time. Something in the room hadn't decided yet what it thought. In the observation gallery, Corinne Duncan's hands went white on the railing. She started to move toward the stairs. Sella didn't turn around, but her hand found the strap of her bag and pressed it once against her leg, the way you'd press a hand to somebody's arm to say stay. Corinne stopped. Her eyes didn't leave Ashby. "I'll run it," Sella said. Ashby's eyebrows went up, delighted. As role player, as the defender, full speed. 90 seconds, like you ran it. The hangar went quiet in the particular way a room full of trained fighters goes quiet when they sense they might be about to watch something go very badly for someone. "That's not how the drill works," Ashby said. "You just told the room nobody's ever been invited to run it on day one," Sella said. "I'm asking. That's different from being invited." Boone let out a short laugh and looked at Ashby like he expected him to shut this down in a sentence. Ashby considered her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from amusement into something closer to appetite. "Fine," he said. "Full speed. 90 seconds. And when this ends the way it ends, we're not doing this again." They reset the mock-up. 2 role players took their marks in the hallway shadows, one holding the training blade. Boone started the clock himself, grinning. Sella stood in the center of the confined space for exactly 2 seconds before she moved. She wasn't fast in the way people expect fast to look. She was economical. The blade came at her from the left, and she wasn't there anymore. She'd pivoted off the center line and taken the role player's wrist with both hands in one motion, using his own forward momentum to fold him down and away instead of muscling against it. The second attacker came from behind, and she used the first man's falling body as a barrier without seeming to plan it. Redirected the second man's grab into a joint lock that put him on his knees, controlled, before he'd finished his first step forward. 19 seconds. The room hadn't caught up to what happened yet. She held the position for a beat, checked both role players were controlled, and stepped back. Ashby's jaw did something small and involuntary. "Sloppy," he said, into a silence that made the words sound worse than if he'd said nothing at all. "You compromised your base on the second transition." "I know," Sela said. "I did it on purpose." His right hand was reaching for something on his belt. "I needed him down faster than a clean base would have gotten him down." One of the role players, still on his knees, looked up at her and then, slowly, over at Ashby. "Have you ever watched a room full of trained fighters realize, in real time, that they might have been laughing at the wrong person?" Ashby recovered the way men like him always do. He straightened his shirt, turned to the class, and spread his hands like he was about to hand out a gift. "What we just witnessed," he said, "is, credit where it's due, an aggressive and reasonably competent execution of a basic scenario. A young woman with prior training and good instincts. Commendable." He let the words sit there like a stone he was setting down carefully. But basic training discipline is not the same thing as combatives mastery. Anyone can be taught to move fast under known parameters. The real test is adaptation, under pressure, to a scenario you've never seen. He turned back to her. "You'll stay. The rest of you are dismissed to processing." His eyes stayed on Sella. "I built a new scenario last night. Nobody's run it. Nobody's seen it. Let's find out if instinct survives contact with something you can't fall back on muscle memory for." Nobody left. Word had already carried into the hallway. 2 other incoming classes were crowding the observation glass. A junior instructor was recording on his phone without announcing it. Colonel Sloan came down from the gallery stairs and stood at the edge of the mat. "Grant," she said, "this isn't necessary." She already demonstrated. If she belongs in this pipeline, Renata, this will be trivial for her, Ashby said, not looking at her. If she doesn't, I'd rather find that out on day one than 3 months in, on a live contract, when the mistake costs somebody more than pride. Colonel Sloane held her ground for a second, then stepped back. She stayed. She watched Ashby the way you watch an experiment you suspect is about to go somewhere its designer didn't intend. Ashby built the new scenario himself, adjusting mats, repositioning 3 role players this time instead of 2, one of them armed with a training pistol instead of a blade. 10 minutes on the clock. No prep. Sella didn't look at her mother. She stepped to the edge of the mat, closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them, and nodded once. She wasn't as clean this time. The camera, because by now there was definitely a camera, held low and steady by the junior instructor pretending not to record, caught her hand hesitate at the 4-minute mark, caught her adjust her footing twice against an angle she clearly hadn't drilled before. At 6 minutes, she took a glancing hit to the shoulder from the training pistol that would have been a real problem if the rounds had been live, and for 1 full second the room held its breath, certain they were about to watch this collapse in front of them. "Tick-tock," Ashby said. She reset her stance instead of panicking, found a new angle, and in the final 90 seconds, she put all 3 role players down. Not textbook, not pretty, but controlled, disarmed, and finished with 4 seconds left on the clock. Ashby walked the mat slowly, studying the sequence like he was hoping to find a technicality. He found one, eventually, and used it. "Adequate," he said, in the exact tone he'd have used to describe weather. "Unorthodox. A properly trained operator would have. Colonel Ashby." The voice came from the second row. Harlow Bennett, another recruit, the tall one who'd moved his bag off the mat earlier without looking at Sella, stood up, hands in his pockets, calm. She just ran 2 scenarios she'd never seen, back to back, one of them with a shortened clock you gave her on the spot, and beat both of them clean. When does she stop being a stunt and start being a student? Ashby's head turned toward him fast enough that his reading glasses slipped down his nose. Nobody laughed this time, not one person in that hangar. Sella walked back toward her bag. She knelt down, unzipped the front pocket, and touched the edge of the green notebook again. This time just to make sure it hadn't been damaged, when Ashby threw the bag against the wall. Her mother, up in the gallery, wiped her face with the back of her hand and didn't try to hide it. Ashby turned to the camera he now knew was recording the facility's official orientation footage. He smoothed the front of his shirt. "Given the public nature this has apparently taken on," he said, choosing each word like he was setting a trap and wanted witnesses to watch him build it, "I propose, with the director's approval, a formal evaluation. Selection day. 3 scenarios, full observation panel. If Ms. Duncan clears at least 2 of 3 against a proper evaluation board, Ironline will have found itself a legitimate threshold success story." He let that land. "If she doesn't, we'll have confirmed, with appropriate documentation, that good instincts and prior enlisted service are not, on their own, sufficient for this program." He turned to her, voice dropping into something that wanted to sound gentle and didn't quite manage it. "Shall we say Monday, 0900? Sella looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, sir," she said. "Monday. I gotta stop right here for a second, because I need you to sit with this." A 61-year-old colonel with 3 decades of training pedigree, looking a 24-year-old woman in the eye and setting a trap he thinks she can't see. "Tell me your jaw isn't tight right now." Mine sure was. And we haven't even gotten to the part where he finds out whose daughter he's actually standing across from. By Friday evening, the clip from the hangar had already left the building. Someone in the crowd at the observation glass had uploaded a shaky vertical video to a page with about 400 followers. By midnight, it had 600,000 views. By Saturday, it had cleared 4 million, and most of the outlets that picked it up ran some version of the same headline. "A Green Beret's daughter walks into an elite academy and gets treated like an intruder, then dismantles the man who tried to embarrass her. Iron Line's communications office released a statement Saturday afternoon that used a lot of words to say almost nothing. Sella's mother didn't let her watch any of it. She hid her own phone in the glove compartment of the rental car and drove them both to a diner instead. And they split a plate of pancakes at a booth in the back. And Corinne told her about a patient she'd had that week, whose baby had come 3 weeks early and was doing fine now. And neither of them mentioned Iron Line once, on purpose. What Corinne did let happen was a visit, Saturday afternoon, from Colonel Renata Sloan, who showed up at their hotel room carrying a thin accordion folder and a box of muffins from a bakery near the base. She sat at the small round table by the window. She didn't offer to coach. "I've run this program for 9 years," she said. "I keep files Ashby doesn't know I keep. Every scenario he's built for the Veil Protocol, going back over a decade. I'm not going to tell you how to beat him Monday. I'm going to tell you he has a pattern. There's something specific he values, something that makes a solution elegant in his eyes. Figure out what that is, and then decide whether you want to give it to him or give the scenario what it actually needs." Sella nodded and took the folder. At the door, Colonel Sloan paused. She looked at Corinne, not at Sella. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I've been deciding since Friday whether it's mine to say. Your husband, Isaiah Duncan, I knew him, not well. But I sat on a promotion review board in 2003, when he was up for a training command billet that would have put him in charge of developing combatives doctrine for 3 pipelines, including this one, before Iron Line existed as a civilian academy. His packet was the strongest in that cycle by a wide margin. The board voted against him. The dissent that carried the room came from a junior instructor cadre lead named Grant Ashby, who wrote, and I'm quoting from a file I was never supposed to keep a copy of, that Isaiah Duncan's technique was, quote, unconventional in a way inconsistent with program standards. I argued against it. I lost by 1 vote. Your husband is the reason I built the Threshold Initiative 11 years later. I should have found you both sooner. I'm sorry." Corinne sat very still at the little table and cried without making a sound. Sella didn't cry. She reached into her bag and pulled out the green notebook, opened it for the first time in front of someone who wasn't her mother, and turned to a page near the back. A page she'd never shown anyone. She ran her fingers over the ink. "Papa," she said quiet, to nobody in the room. "I see you." Sunday came fast. Sella spent the morning at a public range and training space with Harlow Bennett, who'd shown up at their hotel at 6 a.m. with 2 coffees and a duffel of his own gear. "Not coaching you," he said, dropping the coffees on the table. "Just bored, and I like watching good work." She let him stay. Together, they went through Sloan's folder and found the shape of it. Ashby rewarded technique that looked difficult. Extended sequences, multiple redirections, anything that demonstrated visible mastery of complicated systems. He gave less credit to anything that solved a problem too simply, even when simple was faster and safer, because simple didn't look like 30 years of training. By 4 in the afternoon, Sella had stopped drilling. She was staring at a tree line past the fence. "Harlow," she said, "I don't think I'm supposed to play his game." He set his water bottle down. "What do you mean? If I give him what he wants, he wins even when I win. Because then he gets to say, 'See, she learned to do it our way.' If I give the problem what it actually needs, I might lose. But I'll still be me." Harlow looked at her for a long moment. "Your dad sounds like he taught you well." She smiled, just barely. He did. Across the state line in Virginia, Grant Ashby wasn't sleeping. He'd rehearsed his opening remarks in front of the bathroom mirror twice. He'd called the facility's executive director once, trying to get the panel composition changed in his favor, and been told no. He'd called Boone 3 times about managing the footage that was already circulating. And late Sunday night, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and looked at a thin manila folder he hadn't opened in over 20 years. The label, in his own handwriting, read Duncan, I. He closed it without reading it and put it back. He did not know that a retired instructor named Colonel Bettina Renwick, who'd sat on the same 2003 promotion board, had mailed a sealed envelope to Iron Line's executive director that Saturday morning. He did not know that a flight from Fort Bragg had landed that afternoon, carrying a retired Special Forces Master Sergeant who'd asked, quietly, to sit in on Monday's evaluation for reasons he hadn't explained to anyone. He knew none of it. He only knew that on Monday, in front of a live-streamed audience that had crossed 300,000 pre-registrations by Sunday night, he was going to face a 24-year-old black woman he'd already measured and dismissed in his own mind on day one. And some part of him understood, without admitting it, that he could not afford to be wrong about her again. Sunday night, in their hotel room, Sella closed her father's notebook, folded a small handwritten letter, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket. Corinne didn't ask what it said. Sella didn't offer. The drive to the facility left at 6:45 the next morning. Iron Line's main hangar on Monday didn't look like a training facility. It looked like a stadium that had been repurposed on short notice. Bleachers had been trucked in overnight. News vans lined the access road outside the gate. The air smelled like coffee and cold metal. Selah walked in holding her mother's hand. She was wearing her father's old olive fatigue jacket over her training gear, the one thing of his that still fit her, sleeves rolled twice at the cuff. She'd chosen it on purpose. She wanted the room to see it and remember. Iron Line's executive director opened the morning with brief remarks, thanked the observers, restated the evaluation rules. Then she came to her final announcement. Joining our panel this morning on short notice is a retired Special Forces Master Sergeant with 31 years of combatives development experience across 4 federal training pipelines. Please welcome Master Sergeant Desmond Vale. A gasp moved through the bleachers. A sharper one moved through the instructor cadre near the mat, because half of them recognized the name from the doctrine manuals they'd trained out of for a decade. Manuals that carried, on their title pages, the words Vale Protocol. Grant Ashby's face did something small and tight. Desmond Vale walked onto the mat in a plain gray jacket. He nodded once to the panel and once briefly to Sella, a nod she didn't return because she didn't need to. He took the microphone. I'll keep this short. I've reviewed Colonel Ashby's 3 scenarios for today. They're well built. With the director's permission, I'd like to add a 4th. A tiebreaker. My own. The evaluation isn't complete until Ms. Duncan has run it too. The executive director approved it before Ashby could get a word out. His jaw clenched hard enough that the lapel mic caught it. Selah reached into her bag, pulled out her father's notebook, and set it on the equipment table beside the mat. She opened it. For the first time, she opened it in a room full of strangers, and she didn't flinch. Scenario 1 went first. Selah cleared it in under 2 minutes, direct, economical, nothing wasted. Vale nodded without changing his expression. Colonel Sloan wrote something in her notebook and smiled. Ashby, scoring from the panel table, said one grudging word into his microphone, adequate, 1 for 1. Scenario 2 was where it nearly ended. Halfway through, Selah misread an angle. Chased the technically harder redirect instead of trusting the simpler tool her father had drilled into her a decade earlier on a back porch in Georgia. She'd reached instinctively for what Ashby's system rewarded instead of what actually worked. Borrowed shoes. They didn't fit. By the time she caught it, she'd burned too much clock trying to recover. She finished the sequence a half-second past the buzzer, technically incomplete. I'm afraid, Ashby said, in a voice dressed up as gentle, which made it worse. That falls short. No credit. A murmur moved through the bleachers. Somewhere in the back, someone said, loud enough to carry, she's still just a kid compared to the rest of this field. Someone else, quieter, said, told you. Sellah's face, projected on the big screen at the end of the hangar, went very still. She didn't cry. Her jaw tightened once, and then she let it go. She turned, just slightly, toward the bleachers, where her mother stood in the aisle, not sitting. Corinne pressed her right hand flat against her chest and gave one small, firm nod. Sella turned back, walked to the rest area, sat down, and put her hands in her lap. She did not look at Boone, who was leaning over to say something to the recruit beside him. During the 5-minute break, something happened that only got noticed later, when people went back through the footage frame by frame. Colonel Sloan crossed the mat and set a bottle of water and a protein bar on the table in front of Sela without a word, then walked away. It never made the highlight clips. But Sela saw it, and then Master Sergeant Vale, walking back toward the panel table, stopped near her for just a second. He didn't look at her directly. He spoke toward the floor. "Your father taught you a redirect when you were young enough that you were still using 2 hands to hold a training knife," he said. "It's written in that notebook, near the back, in his handwriting. I've been waiting 23 years to see someone run it inside a real evaluation. Don't waste it on Ashby's scenarios. Save it for mine." He walked on. Sella looked down at the notebook, turned to a page near the back. A single diagram sat there in her father's careful hand. Beside it, in pencil, a line addressed to her. "For Sella, when nothing else works, try this one. Love, Dad." She closed the notebook, put her hand flat on the cover, and sat with it for a moment. When the buzzer sounded for Scenario 3, she stood up. Scenario 3 was Ashby's, built specifically to close her out. He'd designed it over the weekend to punish exactly the kind of adaptive, minimal motion approach she favored. Tight quarters, 3 role players, a scenario his own junior staff had privately called, in his hearing, borderline unfair for a selection day evaluation. Sella cleared it in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Not flashy, not fast for the sake of fast. Every motion pulled straight from the early pages of her father's notebook. Vale nodded. Colonel Sloan closed her eyes and let out a breath. Ashby studied the sequence for a long moment and said, this time without softening it, "Correct. 2 of 3. She'd cleared the threshold. Under the original rules, the evaluation was over. She'd passed. But Vale's tiebreaker still remained. And everyone in that hangar understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that the tiebreaker had stopped being about the rules a while ago. Master Sergeant Desmond Vale walked to the equipment table. He picked up a set of training pads and began arranging the scenario himself, slow and deliberate, using footwork markers and hand positions that hadn't been standard doctrine in over 2 decades. A few of the older instructors near the panel table went very still, because they recognized the setup from manuals they'd studied years before anyone called it the Vale Protocol. Ashby, watching him work, went a shade of gray that hadn't been on his face before. Vale finished setting the scenario and turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice. This configuration was first developed at a training review board in the spring of 2003, he said. It was submitted by a candidate under consideration for a command billet in doctrine development. The candidate was rejected. His work was never formally credited under any Army training publication. It has been, for all practical purposes, invisible for 23 years. To my knowledge, no one currently serving has ever run it live. Ms. Duncan, you have 4 minutes. The bleachers didn't murmur this time. They didn't breathe, because the people in the front rows who knew the file were starting to understand exactly what was about to happen. And Grant Ashby, sitting at the panel table, could no longer hear anything Vale was saying. His ears were ringing. Sella walked to the mat, carrying her father's notebook. She set it on the equipment table, open to the marked page. A technician, briefed quickly by Colonel Sloan during the break, adjusted an overhead camera so the notebook page projected onto the massive screen behind the mat, in full view of 300,000 people watching live. The note in the margin was visible to everyone in the building. For Sella, when nothing else works, try this one. Love, Dad. She didn't announce herself. She just began. Here's what she did, in the plainest terms. She didn't invent anything new. She ran the exact redirect sequence her father had diagrammed, the one that used an opponent's forward pressure against a confined space geometry most fighters instinctively avoided. It looked, on the surface, almost too simple for the moment. No flourish, no wasted motion, just precise leverage applied at exactly the right half-second. 3 role players down, controlled. In 2 minutes and 11 seconds, she stepped back. The silence that followed lasted 5 full seconds. The kind of silence that doesn't register on a microphone because a microphone picks up something, however small. This silence picked up nothing at all. Desmond Vale walked to the mat, studied the sequence, and turned to the room. "Correct," he said. Then he said the thing he'd flown up from Fort Bragg to say. "I'd like it noted for the record that the technique Ms. Duncan just executed was originally developed by Sergeant First Class Isaiah Duncan in the spring of 2003, submitted for review to this facility's predecessor training board, and never credited to him under any subsequent publication." He paused. "It bears a striking resemblance to a sequence published 4 years later under a different name, in a training manual still in use at this facility today." He didn't say Ashby's name. He didn't have to. Sella, standing at the equipment table, spoke for the first time in the entire evaluation. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Colonel Ashby, your 2007 Field Manual, Section 4, the redirect sequence you credit to, quote, an unpublished submission from a 2003 review candidate. You never named him. Why?" Ashby opened his mouth. "There were conventions at the time. Candidates who weren't selected were not typically." Harlow Bennett stood up in the bleachers, holding his phone. "From the 2003 Army Training Publication Guidelines, Section 12, he read aloud. All submitted technique material, regardless of the submitting candidate's selection outcome, shall retain individual attribution in any subsequent doctrine publication." I looked it up. The crowd made a sound that wasn't laughter and wasn't applause. It was the sound of a lot of people understanding the same thing at the same moment. Grant Ashby stood slowly, pulled the lapel mic off with a shaking hand. "I was wrong," he said, "about the attribution. And about the daughter." He didn't look at her. Sella closed her father's notebook, picked it up, and walked off the mat. Her mother was waiting at the bottom of the bleacher stairs, arms already open. And there, after 3 days of not crying once, Sella Duncan finally did. The applause lasted 11 minutes. She didn't turn around for any of it. "I've got to be straight with you. I almost couldn't finish putting this one together. Because every soldier I ever knew who was too good for the room they walked into, nobody ever flew a legend in from another state to stand up for them in front of a camera. That's the part that's going to sit with me long after this clip stops trending. If this one's landing somewhere quiet in you, don't shake it off. Sit in it. That's usually where it does the most work." 1 week later, the footage had crossed 40 million views. Clips from the hangar ran on morning shows across 3 networks. A National Defense Affairs publication ran a long piece on unattributed contributions from rejected candidates across military training history, with Isaiah Duncan's name in the second paragraph. Sella appeared, without smiling, on the cover of a Sunday magazine, holding her father's notebook. On a Tuesday morning, Iron Line's executive director found a sealed package on her desk, hand-delivered the day before by Colonel Bettina Renwick, 90 years old, retired from active service since 1998, who'd kept a personal file for over 2 decades that nobody had ever asked her to produce. Inside were letters. Appeals Isaiah Duncan had written to the 2003 Review Board after his rejection, along with the board's denials, several of them signed by a junior instructor cadre lead named Grant Ashby, including a handwritten note attached to the final denial that read, "Candidate possesses skill but lacks the disposition suited to formal doctrine development." The letters went public that Friday. Iron Line's leadership didn't fight it, because by then nobody wanted to. The facility issued a formal statement the following Monday. They posthumously credited Isaiah Duncan as co-author of the training doctrine that had carried his uncredited work for nearly 2 decades. They established a new scholarship, funded at $400,000 annually, open exclusively to veterans transitioning out of active duty from under-resourced backgrounds, named for him. They renamed the main training hangar's mat room the Duncan Room, with a small brass plaque beside the door that reads, Isaiah Duncan, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army Special Forces, Instructor, Father, 1971 to 2003. Grant Ashby released a written apology within the month. He requested and was granted the opportunity to make the program's first private contribution to the Duncan Scholarship in an amount he never disclosed publicly. People who read the letter understood it had been written under considerable pressure. What did Sella Duncan do a week after all of it? She sat at her mother's kitchen table in Georgia with a bowl of cereal and a cup of coffee, going over paperwork for her new full-time instructor contract at Iron Line, the first threshold graduate ever offered a permanent teaching position before finishing the program. Her father's notebook sat propped on the counter behind her, no longer buried at the bottom of a duffel bag, but kept, now, somewhere she could reach it without looking. Her phone rang. Colonel Sloan's voice was warm on the other end. They'd like to name the annual first-day evaluation after your father instead, she said. The board's calling it the Duncan Standard, starting next cycle. They'd like you to run the demonstration. Sella thought about it, chewing a spoonful of cereal. I'm only 24, she said. Yes, said Colonel Sloan. And Sella smiled, small and real, the first one that had nothing complicated behind it. I'll be there, she said.